Welcome back to Anti-Social Studies. Over the last few episodes, we've talked about sectionalism, and the federal government kept putting off talking about the horrific question of slavery, but ultimately it was an issue that had to be resolved one way or another. The growing tension and disagreements amongst various sections of the US was only exacerbated by American expansion. And in the end, despite Congress's best efforts to completely ignore the plight of millions of enslaved Americans, we couldn't avoid dealing with the original sin of the United States anymore. 241 years later than we should have dealt with it, but we'll take it. And it all came to a head when another unlikely president, a rough and tumble, poverty-stricken, semi-educated lawyer from the West, stopped arguing about spots and turned his attention to enslaved people. That's right, it's time to talk about Mr. Penny himself, Abraham Lincoln. Now, Abraham Lincoln has an amazing story, really comparable with Andrew Jackson's rise in a lot of ways. Abe was born in a cabin on the frontier in Kentucky to a weaver's apprentice. His mother, Nancy Hanks, is an ancestor to similarly impressive American Tom Hanks. Seriously, that guy has to insert himself Forrest Gump style into like every American history project he can find. Lincoln's mother died when he was 9, and it was actually his new stepmother who encouraged Lincoln's love of reading. And this was amazing considering that both of his parents were illiterate, and he never attended more than 1 year of school in his entire life. Neighbors remembered him walking miles to borrow a book to bring back to the squatter's cabin his family had built in Indiana. What a sweet, tall little nerd. At 21, he drove a team of oxen on the move to Illinois. At 6 feet 4 inches tall, he was an impressive man who spent the next few years working in almost every job imaginable. Rail splitter, flatboatman traveling down the Mississippi, storekeeper, postmaster, and surveyor. He volunteered to fight in an Indian war where he joked that he fought no Native Americans but had, quote, a good many bloody struggles with the mosquitoes. After considering a career as a blacksmith, he instead decided to pursue the law. And by the way, that should tell us a lot about 19th century US attitudes toward lawyers, like blacksmith, lawyer. No shade to blacksmiths, but that probably wouldn't be someone's two options today. He studied law books on his own, and again, with no formal education, he passed the bar exam in 1836. Within a few years, he was one of the most sought-after lawyers in Springfield, Illinois, earning a salary equivalent to the governor of the state. He entered politics after 20 years practicing the law and earned a reputation for shrewdness, common sense, fairness, and honesty. Within that time, he also married Mary Todd, the quick-witted daughter of a distinguished Kentucky family. They had 4 sons, but 3 died before adulthood. Edward died at 4, Willie at 11, and Tad at 18. Only the oldest, Robert Todd, survived to adulthood. Side note, Robert also became the only known person in history associated with 3 presidential assassinations. He rushed to his father's bedside and was present when he died. He went on to serve as the Secretary of War under President Garfield and was at the train station when he was shot, spoiler alert, by a man who was angry that the president hadn't given him a job. Then Robert was invited to the Pan American Exposition in New York and was nearby when President McKinley was shot by an anarchist. Lesson: presidents should really stop inviting Robert Todd Lincoln to events. Okay, back to Abe. Abraham Lincoln entered politics during the Jacksonian era, and he agreed with the Jacksonian Democrats in a lot of ways. He was concerned about the plight of the common man, but he disagreed with Jackson's belief that the federal government should mostly stay out of the economy. Lincoln believed that it was the job of the federal government to encourage economic development and provide for those who can't provide for themselves. He ended up becoming part of the Republican faction of the Whig Party, but remember that the names of the political parties make no real sense from our modern views. So Lincoln's Republican Party was the one that advocated for a larger federal government and increased power over the states, while 19th century Democrats mostly believed that issues should be left up to the states to decide. And neither party got especially involved in social issues until they were forced to legislate slavery. And on that note, we should be clear that Lincoln was not an abolitionist. He personally believed that slavery was wrong, but he also acknowledged that it had been sanctioned by the founding fathers. At a debate in the 1850s, Lincoln railed against slavery and then ended his rant by acknowledging he had no idea how to solve the problem. Abolitionists were like, "We have an idea." Lincoln actually saw abolitionists as extremists who made the problem worse. During his one term as a congressman, he proposed a bill that would emancipate the enslaved people of DC, but only with the approval of free white citizens. Amazingly, abolitionists and slaveholders all agreed on something. They all hated Lincoln's plan. Also, earlier in his career, he had opposed racial equality. While he believed black people should be free, he did not believe they should be given the same social and political rights as white people, like the right to vote. He even advocated sending freed black people to Liberia or into Central America to colonize other lands rather than coexisting with white Americans. By the end of the Civil War, he would mostly change his stance, but it's another important piece of evidence for the complexity of American views on slavery. Pardon the pun, but it was not black and white. If anything, Lincoln believed that the end of slavery would have to happen gradually over generations to prevent a rebellion from the South, which made his presidency during the Civil War and emancipation especially ironic, because he was kind of right. So how did this one-term congressman from Illinois become one of the greatest presidents in American history? Well, in 1854, his political rival Stephen Douglas passed the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which basically reopened the entire Louisiana Purchase to the possibility of slavery, if those inhabitants voted for it. Lincoln was a free soiler, meaning he didn't believe slavery should be extended to any new territories, so he challenged Douglas for his Senate seat in 1858. Their series of debates were so unique and legendary that there's an entire debate style today dedicated to it. Like, high school students are forced to talk super fast and pick apart the moral and logical arguments of their opponents in Lincoln-Douglas debate tournaments all around the country. I actually know very little about debate tournaments, but... Lincoln later published his debates as part of his presidential campaign, including his most famous speech, in which he argued that the government needed to take a stronger stance against slavery in the territories. Quote, "A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe the government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free. Eventually, the country will become all one thing or all the other." Slave owners everywhere took a big sigh of relief when Lincoln lost the Senate race to Douglas. But then Lincoln pulled a Beto O'Rourke and was like, you know what? Even though I just very publicly lost a state Senate race, I think I'm gonna run for president. His presidential platform was the first ever that pledged to keep slavery out of the territories. Remember that for the last few decades, most politicians, especially people running for president, tried to stay as far away from the slavery issue as possible, especially during an election. But Lincoln gauged correctly that his opposition was split, so he didn't really need to win all the votes. He just needed to keep his Republican base united. In the end, he was right. The Democrats were divided over the issue of slavery, and many of the votes were split across 3 other candidates. Lincoln won in 1860 after receiving just 40% of the votes. He didn't even need to win a majority. He received no votes in the Deep South, and the only future Confederate state that registered any votes for him was the part of Virginia that was soon to break away and become West Virginia and stay with the Union. But still, his support in the North and parts of the West was enough to be a decisive majority in the Electoral College. I think you know the rest, or you will soon. Just 4 weeks later, South Carolina was like, yeah, we're out. Thanks for watching. Like and subscribe and join patreon.com/antisocialstudies.